She became a contract wife to save her brother's future, but she ended up becoming the billionaire heir's future instead. The Garcia estate sat on the quiet northern edge of Baltimore, a sprawling mansion overlooking the water, like a monument to both wealth and the weight that came with it. Edward Garcia had built everything Garcia Industries, his fortune, his name, brick by determined brick, but none of it felt heavy until he started aging. None of it felt fragile until the night he lost his wife, and with her, the balance that used to set everything right. For many years, Edward had been a widower who learned to live with the silence left behind. What he didn't learn was how to raise a boy alone while running an empire. Ronald had grown up loved, but with too much freedom, too much money, and not enough grounding. And now at 35, the boy Edward once held in his hands had become the man he feared losing completely. Ronald Garcia was the kind of billionaire headline the media loved. Playboy. Reckless, constantly photographed, stepping out of Baltimore's most expensive clubs with a different woman each weekend. Glass in his hand, smirk on his lips, no attachments, no accountability, no interest in the company he was supposed to inherit someday. A whirlwind of wasted potential wrapped in expensive clothes. Edward had tried talking to him at the office, at home, at charity events where Ronald would show up late with a girl half interested in philanthropy and fully interested in Ronald's bank account. Edward's voice would rise, then soften, then break. Complaints became warnings, and warnings turned into deep worry. He feared losing the legacy he spent decades building, but that wasn't the fear that kept him up at night. He feared losing his son to the very recklessness he enabled. Everything he tried failed. Nothing made Ronald slow down. Nothing made him think. Nothing reached him. Until one ordinary Thursday morning in early spring, an appointment Edward nearly canceled changed the direction of everything. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and faint lavender, a mixture surprisingly pleasant for a place built on emergencies. Edward had gone in for a routine checkup before his next round of board meetings. He hated hospitals, hated the reminder of mortality, but at 62 his doctor insisted, and that was when he met her. Carol Young walked into the examination room with a soft smile that felt like a warm blanket, placed gently across tired shoulders. Tall, graceful, with long, sleek dark hair pulled into a low ponytail. She moved with a quiet confidence that made Edward straighten without realizing. She wore the simple mint green uniform of a nurse assistant, but she carried herself with more dignity than most CEOs he'd met. "Mr. Garcia, I'll be helping you today," she said in a voice smooth and steady, kind, professional, patient. As she took his vitals, she asked about the temperature of the room, his comfort, whether he had eaten. Small gestures, but ones he hadn't felt in years, not since his late wife would fuss over his health like he were the most precious thing she owned. Something about Carol's presence, her gentle steadiness, reminded him of her, not in appearance, but in spirit. Grounded, warm, steady. When the doctor stepped out briefly, Carol quietly excused herself, leaving the door slightly ajar. Edward didn't mean to overhear, but her voice drifted down the hallway, soft but firm. "Patrick, calm down. Yes, I know the tuition deadline is next week. I'll find a way, okay, I promise. Don't worry about it." Silence, then her voice again, but cracked around the edges. "Yes, I'll cover it. Just focus on your exams. I've got you." A sigh, a tired one, the kind that carried years of strain in its lungs. Edward felt something shift inside him. When she came back in, that soft professional smile was back, hiding whatever storm sat behind it. But he'd seen enough. He'd heard enough. And for the first time in a long time, an idea sparked in his mind, an idea desperate, unusual, and a little ridiculous. But he had nothing else left. After the appointment ended and she handed him the paperwork, Edward cleared his throat. "Ms. Young, may I speak to you in private?" She blinked, confused but polite. "Of course, sir." He explained slowly, carefully about his son, his worry, his desperation, about Ronald's lifestyle and the path he was headed down. Then, with more shame than he expected, he presented his proposal. A contract, temporary, 6 months, to act as his wife, to make Ronald rethink his choices, to force him to confront himself, to wake him up. Carol stared at him in shock, horror, disbelief. Her cheeks flushed, her hands trembled even though she kept them clasped. "That's not appropriate," she whispered. "I know," Edward admitted. I know how it sounds. But I'm out of options, Carol. She shook her head. I'm just a nurse assistant. I don't pretend. I don't manipulate people. And I definitely don't. She stopped, biting her lip hard as if stopping tears. The thought of Patrick, his tuition, his future. Edward didn't push. He simply placed a business card on the counter. Think about it. I promise you one thing. You will be protected, legally, financially, and there will be no intimacy. None. This is purely an act. He walked away with no expectation she would call. But she did. 2 days later, reluctantly, nervously, and only because she had run out of options. Carol sat in Edward's office, wringing her hands, eyes full of shame and determination. I don't like this, she confessed. But my brother has 1 more year of school and he's depending on me. I can't afford his tuition anymore. I've tried everything. Edward nodded slowly. I understand. She set her jaw. If I agree, it has to be under strict conditions. Name them, he said. No intimacy, not even by mistake, agreed. No expectation beyond acting. Of course, 6 months. No longer. Done. Edward slid a contract across the table, long, detailed, protecting her at every step. She read every line twice before signing with a shaking hand. When she lifted her eyes, there was fear in them, but also hope. For her brother. For stability. For a temporary solution that wouldn't demand pieces of her soul she wasn't willing to give. Edward stood, offering no celebratory handshake, only a quiet nod of gratitude. Thank you, Carol. I know this isn't easy. She swallowed hard. No, it isn't. 2 weeks later, Ronald returned to the estate. After a 3-day streak of partying in D.C., his shirt was wrinkled, his hair messy, and his eyes tired beneath expensive sunglasses. He strolled into the living room with a lazy smirk. Hey, Dad, you wanted, he froze. Standing beside his father was a striking young woman, black, beautiful, graceful, with long dark hair cascading over her shoulders. Her posture was polite but firm, her eyes warm but cautious. Edward cleared his throat. Ronald, meet your new stepmother, Carol. The smirk vanished. Ronald removed his glasses as if his vision was playing tricks on him. What? Step what? His gaze snapped between them. Dad, she's very young. You're 62. Carol lowered her eyes, embarrassed but composed. Ronald's shock quickly morphed into suspicion. No young woman that beautiful married a 62-year-old billionaire out of love. There had to be a reason. But for some reason, he couldn't tear his eyes away from her. Something about her presence tugged at him, soft, quiet, unfamiliar, unlike the bold party girls he surrounded himself with. His father placed a steady hand on Carol's shoulder. You'll treat her with respect, Ronald. Ronald nodded stiffly, unable to decide if he was irritated or intrigued. Maybe both. That night, Carol cooked dinner, a simple meal of roasted chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, and sautéed vegetables. Nothing extravagant. But the aroma drifted through the halls like a promise of home. Ronald didn't know he missed. He entered the dining room late out of habit, expecting 2 empty seats. Instead, the table was full. His father sat at the head. Carol sat beside him, serving food with quiet care. Ronald stood there, frozen again. Edward raised an eyebrow. Join us. It was the first time Ronald had been invited to dinner in years. He sat down slowly, awkwardly, and watched Carol in secret glances. She didn't flirt, didn't giggle, didn't try to impress him. She simply served him food with a polite nod, her eyes lifting once to check on him like he mattered in some small human way, and Ronald felt something unexpected. Warmth. It unsettled him. The food was incredible, simple but rich with care. He ate more than he intended, and Carol smiled faintly when she noticed. The next night, Ronald came home early. Then earlier still. He joined dinner without being asked. He tried helping Carol carry plates, though she gently refused. Their interactions became soft, awkward exchanges of glances and polite words. But beneath the politeness was something else, something charged and tender and entirely new. Edward watched it all unfold quietly. His son coming home early. His son eating at the table. His son looking at Carol not with lust, but with something deeper forming. A spark, a shift, something Edward feared he would never see happen naturally. As days passed, Ronald showed up earlier, stayed longer, asked questions about Carol's day, about her brother, about her cooking. Carol remained careful but kind, her boundaries clear yet her warmth genuine. And through it all, Edward watched with a mixture of hope and guilt. His plan was working. But it was also becoming something else entirely, something he hadn't predicted, something no one in that house was ready for. The days that followed had a strange rhythm to them, one that none of the three people in the Garcia mansion could fully understand. Yet each felt the shift in their own way. Carol felt it in the quiet weight of Ronald's eyes whenever he entered a room. Ronald felt it every time he walked through the front doors and didn't feel the usual emptiness he used to drown in. Edward felt it like a slow exhale of hope every time he saw his son sit at the dining table without being called. It began with the smallest things. Ronald, once allergic to anything that resembled responsibility, found himself easing into work at the company. Not because he suddenly cared about profit margins or board meetings, but because he discovered something he cared about more: Carol's opinion. He woke up earlier, showered properly instead of stumbling out with a hangover, and walked into Garcia Industries with an air of someone trying to look respectable, trying to understand, trying to be the kind of man someone like Carol wouldn't shake her head at. He had no idea if she noticed. But Edward did. At home, Ronald tried even harder. When Carol set the table for dinner, he would appear by her side, reaching for plates, cups, anything. "I can help," he'd say, already picking up items before she protested. "You don't have to," she would reply, soft but firm. "I want to." Sometimes she'd let him. Sometimes she'd gently take the plate from his hands, reminding him she could manage. When the hallway light flickered one evening, Ronald fetched tools he barely knew how to use and fixed it after 3 failed attempts. "Are you okay?" Carol asked. "Perfect," he said, though his hand stung from a small cut. "Just doing some home maintenance. You know, man of the house stuff." Carol smiled faintly. You could have called someone to do it." "I know," he said quietly, "but you're here. I don't want things breaking down around you." Another time, he offered to drive her to the hospital when she was running late. She declined, saying she preferred walking or taking the bus. It gave her time to clear her head. "Still," he said, "if you ever need a ride, you don't even have to ask. I'll be there." Carol thanked him politely, maintaining the invisible line she never crossed. Edward watched all of this with cautious optimism. He said nothing. But every night, sitting at the dining table, he saw Ronald's posture soften, saw his tone warm, saw the Playboy melt into a man who waited for Carol's smile the way he once waited for the next party invitation. The change was slow but unmistakable. Ronald was trying, for her. It was strange wanting someone's approval. Strange and humbling. Ronald had never tried to impress a woman in his life. He was used to being the center of attention. Women flocked to him because of his looks, his money, his name. But Carol didn't look at him that way. She saw through him, around him, past him, and that made him desperate to be seen properly. He found himself asking questions at work so he wouldn't sound like an idiot when Edward mentioned business at dinner. He found himself reading up on healthcare workers, wanting to understand Carol's world. He toned down his vulgar jokes, wiped his shoes at the door, started going to bed earlier instead of crawling in at sunrise. But the question that gnawed at him most was the one he couldn't voice. "Is she happy with my father?" He didn't want to imagine her trapped in a loveless arrangement. His father was kind, but he was still 62. Carol was 28, beautiful, full of life. Someone who deserved someone who could actually walk beside her, not behind her with aching joints. One evening, while Edward attended a late meeting, Ronald and Carol found themselves alone in the living room. A soft lamp glowed behind them, the air warm and quiet. Ronald sat beside her, not close enough to intrude, but close enough to feel the gravity between them. "You look tired," he said softly. "It's been a long day," she replied. "One of my patients passed away. I stayed with the family until they were ready to leave." He looked at her then, not as the woman who cooked dinner, not as the woman his father married, but as someone carrying pain he couldn't see. "Does it get easier?" he asked. Carol shook her head slowly. "Not really. But I grew up learning that people depend on you more when you're hurting. My brother depended on me after our parents died. I had to grow up fast so he didn't fall apart." Ronald stared at her, breath caught. "How old were you?" he asked. 18, she whispered. Patrick was 10. I was working part-time, studying full-time, grieving full-time. I barely slept. I barely ate, but I had to be strong. There was no other option. I was all he had. Ronald couldn't speak for a moment. His chest tightened with an emotion he didn't have a name for. "You carried all that alone," he finally whispered. She nodded. "That's life, Ronald. Some people don't get to fall apart. They don't get to be reckless. They don't get to make mistakes and have someone clean them up. He swallowed hard. He was the living definition of everything she never had the luxury to be. Something inside him broke open. 2 days later at breakfast, Edward cleared his throat, folding a newspaper before setting it on the table. "I'll be traveling for a short business trip," he announced casually. Carol looked up, startled. Ronald stiffened. "For how long?" Ronald asked. "A few days. Maybe a week. I'll know when I get there." Carol nodded politely. Later that afternoon, while Ronald was out, Edward quietly walked through the house, installing tiny cameras in corners no one would think to check, bookshelves, hallways, lamps. He didn't enjoy the deception, but he needed to know the truth. Not about Carol, about Ronald. When he finally left for the airport, Carol insisted she would stay in the guest room. "It's better for appearances," she told Ronald, "and better for boundaries." Ronald nodded, respecting her decision even though he wished she didn't feel the need. Thus began a week that neither of them would forget. With Edward gone, the mansion felt quieter, not empty, but softer. Ronald didn't hover, didn't push, didn't flirt. He simply existed near her. They ate dinner together at the long table, though they sat much closer now. They talked more freely without Edward's watchful eye. He learned about her favorite childhood music, her fear of thunderstorms, her dream of becoming a registered nurse someday. She learned about his first heartbreak in high school, the loneliness behind his party lifestyle, the way he always felt like he was disappointing someone. One night, they sat on the patio overlooking the dark water. "I never realized how good you are at listening," Carol said with a small smile. "I never had a reason to be," Ronald replied. She looked at him, eyes softening. He looked at her too long. She looked away too quickly. But the air between them changed, warmer, deeper, dangerous in a way that wasn't physical but emotional. He wasn't seeing her beauty anymore. He was seeing her. It was raining the night the truth came out, soft, steady rainfall tapping against the windows like a heartbeat. Ronald approached Carol in the living room, heart thudding. She looked up from the book she was reading, hair falling over her shoulder, wrapped in a blanket. "Carol," he said gently, "can I ask you something?" She sensed the weight in his tone and set the book aside. "Of course," she said. He sat across from her, elbows resting on his knees. "Why did you marry my father?" Her breath caught. For the first time since the contract began, she didn't have a prepared answer. She looked down at her hands. And then she told him the truth. About Patrick's education, about the tuition she couldn't afford, about her financial struggles, about the fear that kept her awake at night, the fear of failing the only family she had left. Ronald felt something break inside him. "I judged you," he whispered. "I thought you were here for money, but not like this. Not for selfish reasons. Not for yourself. Don't apologize," she said quietly. "You didn't know." "But I should have," he insisted. "I should have seen you. Really seen you." Carol smiled sadly. "Most people don't." He leaned back, swallowing hard, feeling guilt twist through him like a blade. "I'm sorry, Carol, truly," and she heard the sincerity. The rain outside intensified. A soft roar against the glass, matching the storm inside Ronald's chest. "You deserve better," he said suddenly. Carol blinked, stunned. "Ronald," she began. No, he cut in firmly. "You deserve better than this arrangement. Better than pretending. Better than carrying the weight of your whole world alone." He moved closer, not touching her, but close enough she could feel the truth in his voice. "If you divorce my father, I'll take care of Patrick, and you. I'll make sure you never worry about anything again." She stared at him, breath caught, unsure whether to run or stay frozen. "I'm not saying this because I want something from you," he continued, voice hushed and trembling. "I'm saying it because you deserve more than a bargain. You deserve love, a real partner, a life that doesn't drown you." His eyes glistened. "I want to be that for you." The words hung between them, raw and trembling. Carol's lips parted, but she couldn't speak. She had no script for this, no practiced response. And that's when the front door opened. Edward stepped inside quietly, expecting to catch Ronald doing something reckless or disrespectful. Instead, he saw his son sitting across from Carol. Faces close, voices soft, expressions heavy with emotion but not impropriety. Not lust, something deeper. He didn't interrupt verbally. He simply watched for a moment, then stepped fully into the room. Carol and Ronald looked up sharply. "Dad," Ronald said, standing quickly. "You're early." Edward offered a small, unreadable smile. The trip was shorter than expected. He excused himself and walked upstairs, but his hands trembled slightly as he pulled out the tablet linked to the cameras. He watched the footage. Every moment. Every conversation. Every hesitation. Every boundary respected. Every truth shared. Every crack in Ronald's superficial shell revealing something real underneath. By the time the footage ended, Edward's eyes stung. His son wasn't lusting after Carol. He was falling in love with her. Genuinely. Deeply. And for the first time, Edward realized his plan had worked. Just not in the way he expected. Edward Garcia had always believed he had lived long enough to stop being surprised by life. Losing his wife years ago had carved a hollow in him that he filled with responsibility. Company duties and fatherhood. Loving Ronald had kept him anchored, but watching Ronald live recklessly had taken a toll. Bringing Carol into their lives was never meant to be romantic. It was meant to be grounding, an intervention that would steady Ronald and remind him of the humanity he was losing. But as Edward stood in the quiet of his study that morning, knowing what he had seen on the cameras and what he had observed with his own eyes when he returned unexpectedly, he realized something uncomfortable. His plan had worked. It had worked too well, and now he had to deal with the consequences. Consequences that included his son falling in love with a woman Edward himself had brought under his roof. Edward waited until Carol finished tidying up the dining table before asking her to join him in his study. She walked in hesitantly, her hands clasped gently in front of her. She always carried herself with quiet dignity, even in fear. The soft lamplight illuminated her warm brown skin, and Edward could see the fatigue in her eyes, not the kind caused by dishonor, but the weight of a woman trying to carry burdens too big for her shoulders. Carol, Edward began, not harshly, not accusingly, just truthfully. I saw how you and Ronald were talking. Her breath caught and she looked down. Shame was not what she felt, fear of misunderstanding was. Edward continued gently. I need you to tell me the truth. Have you developed feelings for him? She swallowed hard. Mr. Garcia, I never crossed boundaries. I never meant for anything to be confusing. I am not accusing you, he said softly. I am simply asking. Carol's lips parted and she took a slow breath, as though she needed courage to answer. I did not expect any of this. Ronald is kind when he wants to be, and he listens. I have never had that from anyone besides Patrick. I care about your son, but I never disrespected you. I never let anything become inappropriate. Her voice trembled slightly. Edward believed her instantly. He had watched the footage. He had seen Ronald leaning in, not with lust but with sincerity. He had seen Carol stepping back each time, gently maintaining space. It had never been her fault. Edward exhaled slowly. My dear, I know. That is why I am not angry. I am relieved in a strange way. She blinked. Relieved? Because it means my son is not a lost cause. His voice softened with fatherly ache. He finally cares about something, someone. Carol's eyes widened slightly, her chest tightening with a mix of guilt and confusion. Edward sighed deeply. My plan was to bring stability into Ronald's life. I did not foresee that stability would come from his feelings for you. But I cannot deny what I saw. You have made him better, Carol. And that is something I have prayed for. Her gaze lowered again, this time with emotion rather than discomfort. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I know, Edward whispered. And you have not. What neither of them said, at least not yet, hung heavily between them. The woman they both cared for was the same. Ronald did not try to hide when Edward asked him to sit down. He seemed almost ready for the confrontation. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by something rawer, more exposed. He sank onto the edge of the sofa, elbows on his knees, fingers laced together tightly. Edward observed him quietly for a moment. This was no longer the boy who stumbled in at 4 a.m. smelling of alcohol and perfume. This was a man in turmoil. Son, Edward said softly, I saw how you looked at Carol. Ronald's jaw flexed. I figured you would. Tell me the truth. How do you feel about her? Ronald closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with visible vulnerability. Dad, I'm tired. I am tired of clubs. Tired of women who want nothing from me except money or attention. Tired of waking up and feeling like none of it means anything. Edward's breath caught. He had not heard his son speak with this level of honesty in years. Ronald's voice dropped, almost breaking. She made me want to be better. She made me think. Care. Try. Edward blinked back sudden tears. Ronald whispered, "For the first time, I want something real." And that was when Edward broke quietly, silently, but deeply. He leaned back, wiping the corner of his eye. "I have been waiting to hear you say that your entire life." Ronald looked up, startled. Edward smiled sadly. "I am proud of you, not because you fell in love, but because you grew." The room filled with an emotion neither man dared name: healing. Later that evening, Edward called Carol back to his study. She walked in cautiously, unsure whether Ronald had already spoken to his father. Edward gestured for her to sit. "I want to free you from the contract," he said gently. Carol's eyes widened. "But the 6 months, it does not matter anymore," he cut in softly. "My intention was to help my son, not trap you, and you have done far more for this family than any contract required." Her lips parted in shock, gratitude, and confusion. "Mr. Garcia, I do not know what to say." "Say nothing," Edward smiled. "Just follow your heart, not the agreement." Her throat tightened. "Thank you for trusting me." He shook his head. "No, thank you. You changed Ronald's life, and you reminded me of my wife's kindness. For that, I will always be grateful." For a moment, the older man and the young woman held a quiet understanding, one built on mutual respect and bittersweet acceptance. Ronald did not run to her. He did not corner her or press. He found her in the backyard, sitting quietly with a cup of tea, eyes distant. He approached slowly, respectfully. "Can I join you?" he asked softly. She nodded, though her hands tightened around her mug. Ronald took a breath. "I am not asking you to marry me. Not yet. I know how messy this looks, how scary it must feel." Carol looked at him carefully. Ronald swallowed, surprisingly nervous. "I want to date you. Not as Ronald Garcia, the billionaire playboy, but as me." She looked down at her hands. "Ronald, this will look terrible in the public eye. People will think I do not care what they think," he said gently but firmly. "I care what you feel." Her eyes glistened slightly. "I am scared. I do not want to be a rumor or a scandal." "You will not be," Ronald whispered. "Not with me. Not anymore." Something in his tone, mature and steady, slowly broke down her resistance. The weeks that followed tested both of them. Ronald made a decision that shocked everyone, including his closest friends. He started therapy. He attended sessions twice a week without fail, finally confronting the emptiness he had masked with luxury and chaos. He also began taking an active role in the company, showing up early, meeting department heads, reading annual reports. Edward watched from a distance, pride blooming in his chest like something tender and long forgotten. Carol and Ronald dated quietly. There were no flashy dinners, no paparazzi-friendly gestures. Instead, they shared late-night talks in the kitchen over tea, walks around the neighborhood, and meaningful silences that spoke louder than words. It was not dramatic, it was real. Patrick, Carol's younger brother, visited often. He and Ronald bonded surprisingly quickly, and when things became serious, Patrick eventually moved in with them, forming a small, unconventional family built on mutual respect and evolving love. Their wedding was nothing short of extravagant. A warm Baltimore afternoon, a church filled with close friends and relatives, soft music floating through the air like something sacred. Edward walked Carol down the aisle, his hand steady, his eyes shining with pride and affection. He did not feel like he was giving her away. He felt like he was gaining peace. Ronald stood at the altar, transformed. His suit was crisp, but it was his expression, soft, reverent, emotional, that told the real story. When Carol reached him, he took her hands gently. Edward stepped back, watching with the quiet joy of a father who had finally witnessed his son grow into the man he was meant to be. Their vows were simple, honest, powerful. When the ceremony ended, the applause carried warmth, hope, and new beginnings. Patrick called Ronald Big Bro within weeks. Carol continued working part-time as a nurse, assistant while studying to advance her medical career. Ronald supported her dreams fully, taking pride in seeing her shine in her own right. Edward watched Ronald run the company with discipline in his whole heart. He watched Carol bring gentle balance to the home, and he found peace in knowing that his son, once lost in nightlife and chaos, now stood firmly on the path of love, responsibility, and purpose. Late one evening, Carol stood on the balcony of their home, gazing at the Baltimore skyline. The wind brushed against her skin, cool and comforting. She wrapped her arms around herself, breathing in the city lights. Ronald stepped behind her, slipping his arms around her waist, resting his chin lightly on her shoulder. "You okay?" he murmured. She nodded softly. Just thinking. About what? She leaned back against him. Everything. How strange life is. How one choice changed everything. Ronald tightened his hold and whispered, "You were not the lesson my father wanted me to learn. You were the gift he did not expect." Carol turned, eyes softening, and their lips met slowly, gently, with the kind of warmth that comes only from truth, healing, and second chances. And in that moment they stood not as a contract gone wrong, not as a scandal avoided, but as two souls who had transformed each other. A home built on honesty, a family built on love, a future built on unexpected beginnings. Thank you so much for watching and supporting my channel. Your love, comments, and shares mean everything to me. Grateful for each of you. Let's keep growing together. With love from Whispers of Hope.